I was going to be speaking today about the psychological impact of COVID, but Yelena asked me to change the presentation in view of the recent tragic events in Serbia. So I'm going to be talking about homicide and approaching it from the perspective of personal construct psychology. Now, this was an approach developed by an American psychologist, George Kelly, in 1955. And nowadays, many approaches in psychology and other fields are called constructivist. But Kelly's was the first really fully elaborated constructivist psychological theory. And by a constructivist theory, we mean that he regarded people as actively constructing their worlds. As he said, man looks at his world through transparent patterns or templates, what he called constructs, which he creates and then attempts to fit over the realities of which the world is composed. And for Kelly, people are primarily concerned with anticipating their world. They make predictions. Their predictions are either validated or invalidated. So this is another constructivist sounding quote. All matters turn not on reality, but on perception of reality. A virtue or an evil is only as significant as one believes it to be. That wasn't written by Kelly. It was written by Ian Brady, a British serial killer. Brady and his partner killed at least 6 children and young people in the 1960s. And many years later, Brady wrote a book about his specialist subject of serial killing. And the quote that I just shown you was taken from that book. When I read the book, I was intrigued because a lot of it could have been written by George Kelly. It had a very constructivist flavor. And I wrote to Ian Brady. I knew he was quite widely read. I wondered if he'd read any of the work of George Kelly. I didn't expect to get a reply, but eventually he did reply. I was quite relieved to find that he hadn't read any of Kelly's works. But this started quite a long correspondence between us, and I went to meet him on a couple of occasions. And what I was trying to do was adopt what George Kelly called a credulous attitude, which is looking at the world through the other person's eyes, trying to make sense of their view of the world, which doesn't mean that you necessarily agree with them, but at least you have to try and understand their view. I quite like taking things to their limits, and so I was trying to find out whether one can adopt a credulous attitude with someone whose views and actions are very different from one's own. And this is quite different from many approaches in forensic psychology. Someone called Nee has written that forensic psychologists rarely pay heed to offenders' views of things. Little investment is made into looking at their perspective. Probably the most famous technique in personal construct psychology, which enables you to look at the world through another person's eyes, is something called the repertory grid. And this is usually done by getting the individual to rate various people in their lives and aspects of themselves in terms of their constructs. It's usually done in an interview setting, but a narrative can also be converted into a grid, and I wouldn't recommend it unless you have a lot of time on your hands. A whole book can be converted into a repertory grid. And this is what I did with Ian Brady's book. First of all, I extracted all the constructs that he had used in the book. And these are some of the ways in which he construes himself. And you can see that a lot of them have to do with philosophical beliefs, having relativistic thought processes, having freedom of thought, believing a supreme individualist should choose their own life in the moment of their death, rather be dead than stare into an abyss, and so on. And then these are constructs that he used to describe serial killers in general. Again, many to do with values and beliefs, some of them quite chilling, regarding the willful destruction of others and the self as comic, believing in a hell on earth, inhabiting a fourth dimension, seeing deeper than most. There are many ways in which one can analyze repertory grids, and this is an analysis of the grid of Brady's book. Basically, these are all the people described in the book. The ones at the bottom are all serial killers. The ones at the top are people who are not serial killers. And the length of the lines indicates the strength of the connections between these people. And the fact that there are longer lines at the bottom indicates that Brady has a more elaborated view of serial killers than of people in general. But interestingly, himself is dissociated from other serial killers. No time to really go into that in detail, but let's go on to some quotes from the book. George Kelly regarded everything we do as an experiment. And for Brady, killing is an experiment. Sometimes it's the most stimulating experience to do something you don't want to do, don't approve of, and are legally prescribed from experiencing, just to discover new aspects of yourself and others. If killing is an experiment, then you could regard serial killing as a research program. And Brady talks about the progress from the first murder, where the person is killing his long accepted self as well as the victim, cutting the umbilical connection between himself and mankind. Moving on to the second murder, where the killer might try and give it a more aesthetic flavor, and eventually proceeding to an addiction to what Brady called hedonistic nihilism. And if you look at the writings of serial killers, they often sort of give a flavor of trying to recapture the experience of the first murder. This person, a Russian serial killer, describes the first murder as like first love. It's unforgettable. He had an ambition of killing one person for each of the 64 squares on the chessboard. Unfortunately for one individual, he was captured after he'd killed 63 people. Brady also writes about killing as an escape from chaos. The serial killer, conceiving life as meaningless, death as nothingness, isn't afraid to die or kill in an attempt to introduce some degree of design. The serial killer has confronted the chaos or absurdity of existence and is trying to impose upon it some meaning and order of his own. And a recurrent theme in his writing is destruction as an act of creation. I think an example of this is this guy, another British serial killer, Dennis Nilsson. He picked up homeless young men from the streets, took them home, fed them, and strangled them. And then he bathed their bodies and kept their bodies as company until they decomposed. And he writes here about washing the body of one of his victims, lying him on his bed, putting talc on him to make him look cleaner. He looked really beautiful, just like one of those Michelangelo sculptures. For the first time in his life, he was looking the best he ever did. I just lay there. Great peace came over me. I felt this was it, the meaning of life, death, everything. For serial killers, you can regard killing as the way of life that they have chosen. This is an Austrian serial killer, Rudolf Pleil, who writes, "Every man has his passion. Some prefer whist, the card game. I prefer killing people." And a couple of American serial killers. Serial killing has enabled this one to see himself as the only successful member of my family. And similarly, I think of it as an achievement because I've achieved absolutely nothing in my lifetime. And to murder and get away with it, keep murdering, was an achievement. In his writings, to me, Brady talked about his philosophy of moral relativism. And he wrote about seeing what he has done as relatively trivial compared to what he called American gangsters. And this was the time of the Iraq War, and he was meaning not the mafia, but the Bush gang of ex-oil executives and their recent successful armed robbery in Iraq. And he was highly critical both of George Bush and of Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister at the time. He also writes about morality and takes a very similar view to George Kelly. Kelly believed that each of us has a core role. We essentially have our own moral convictions, and we feel guilty if we find ourselves behaving in a way which is dislodged from those personal convictions. And Brady also talks about people as having idiosyncratic moral gyroscopes, reminding him whether he's in conflict with his own moral and ethical convictions or merely those of others. So for Brady, serial killers have moral convictions just as much as anyone else has. They have their own personal code of ethics, albeit eccentric to the ordinary individual. And they can possess just as many admirable facets of character as anyone else. I think an example of this is maybe Rudolf Höss. He was the commandant of Auschwitz. He organized the killing of at least 2.5 million people. And while he was in prison waiting for his death sentence, he was persuaded to write his autobiography. And naturally enough, I analyzed it as a repertory grid. The only thing I'm going to point out here is that down at the bottom is Höss as an adult, and he sees himself as very different from anyone else. But the people he sees himself as closest to are Jews. So he has killed millions of Jews. In personal construct psychology, there's a notion of threat, that we are threatened by people who remind us of some aspect of ourselves that we don't want to look at. Conceivably, Höss in some way was threatened by Jewish people, and one way of removing threat is to kill them. And he felt no guilt for what he had done. He was proud of the efficient way in which he carried out his task. He writes, "I was never cruel. I've never maltreated anyone, even in a fit of temper." This man is very similar. Comrade Douche, commandant of the Khmer Rouge Cambodian Interrogation Center, S21, where virtually everyone who was admitted was tortured and eventually killed. And he writes, "I applied myself. I never violated discipline. Malice and cruelty formed no part of our ideology." So he was obeying orders dutifully. Both Höss and Douche write that the only things that made them feel guilty was when their staff did things in a way which wasn't entirely according to the rule book. Interrogators at S21 who used forms of torture which weren't in the prescribed list of tortures. This is a very different person. One of my clients who was referred for treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. And when I first saw him, he wasn't able to talk about the traumatic event. He just called it the big event. So I asked him to write what Kelly calls a self-characterization, basically a short autobiographical description. And this is some of what he wrote. Where do we start? How about birth? I was born in Newtown on the 6th of February, 1955. I don't remember the birth. Perhaps I was too young. Maybe I had my eyes closed. I went to nursery, then went on to primary school, before going on to the local secondary school, where my studies were interrupted by an unforeseen event. I killed my father. I don't really know why. My memory of the event doesn't appear full. I was a little screwed up afterwards and probably still am today. So he is what's called a reactive killer. He's reacted to provocation by killing, in his case, his father, which is something which is very different from his usual view of himself. And therefore he feels guilty. He can't process what he's done. Very different from people like Ian Brady and serial killers. Let me just mention something about suicide because it's relevant to mass murder. Kelly differentiated between various different types of suicide. One of them he called suicide as a dedicated act, where the person kills themselves in order that some aspect of them or their value system can live on. Chaotic suicide, a bit similar to what Brady said about chaos. Everything seems so unpredictable that the only definite thing to do is to abandon the scene altogether. And a very different type of suicide, which I won't talk about now, called deterministic suicide. Now, the relevance to mass murder is that mass murderers often anticipate that they will themselves die. I don't know whether any of you recognize this guy. He is Andreas Lubitz, the German pilot who flew his plane and all of its passengers into the side of a mountain. And he had written that one day I will do something that will change the whole system, and then all will know my name and remember it. I don't know what he means by changing the system, but one thing that did change as a result of what he did is that pilots are no longer allowed to be in the cockpit by themselves. You may or may not remember this name, Eric Harris, one of the Columbine school killers, who'd written it'll be like the LA riots, World War II, Vietnam, all mixed together. I want to leave a lasting impression on the world. So suicide and murder as a dedicated act. Another mass murderer, Anders Breivik. He wrote a 1,500-page document, emailed it to 1,000 addresses. It was called a European Declaration of Independence. Left home, bombed government buildings in Oslo, killing 8 people, and then went to a Labour Party youth camp where he shot 69 young people. Trying to make sense of what he'd done, I read his European Declaration of Independence, and it was very, very boring until I got to part of it, which essentially was a self-characterization. He described it as an interview with a Justicia Knight Commander of the Knights Templar. And it was clear that it was an interview of Breivik by himself. And it talked about his early life, and there were many, many experiences of invalidation. And I extracted from it some of the constructs that he used to describe his old self. And he had a very negative view of himself, ignorant about most issues, self-centered, arrogant, not caring for anyone. Whereas his new self, as a mass murderer, is someone who is selfless, has self-insight, extremely patient, has improved morally, is more responsible. And he described himself as the perfect knight. I will gladly sacrifice my life for the benefits of my European brothers and sisters. That's not the kind of person I used to be, but it's the type of person I've become. I'm perhaps the biggest champion of cultural conservatism Europe has ever witnessed. Destroyer of cultural Marxism, a perfect example, the perfect knight. A destroyer of evil and a bringer of light. And interestingly, he uses a quote that's also included in Ian Brady's book. It's better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep. Neither he or Brady attributed the author of the quote, but in fact it was Mussolini. And based on the work on Breivik, but also some work that a colleague and I have carried out on radicalized Salafist Muslims in Tunisia, we've developed a personal construct model of radicalization where the individual has a lot of experiences of invalidation and uncertainty, and developing their radical beliefs allows them to develop a new sense of identity and a more structured and certain view of the world. This often involves extreme negative views of another group, allowing them to regard themselves in a much more positive light by contrast with this other group. And then they constantly seek out evidence to shore up their new radical constructions of the world. And I think this model can also be applied to many mass murderers. So finally, the title of this talk arises from the fact that when I went to meet Ian Brady, I automatically put out my hand to shake his, and then found myself recoiling when I remembered what his hand had done. And constantly throughout this work, I've wondered whether one should try to shake hands with a serial killer, metaphorically. Should one try and see the world through their eyes? Or should one simply dismiss them as a monster, as the president of Serbia has done with the recent mass murderers? These monsters will never see the light of day. It's a psychologist called Densley who has said that if we explain the problem as pure evil, or other labels like a terrorist attack or a hate crime, it might make us feel better, because we see if it seems like we found the motive and solved the puzzle, but we haven't really solved anything. What this terminology does is prevent us from recognizing that mass shooters are us. And similarly, this was from an article about the Columbine high school killing. People may and sometimes do willingly embrace an identity and choose a pathway that, when viewed from the outside, is dark and destructive. We need to understand the process by which individuals opt for a dark vision if we hope to prevent such choices. But this is difficult to do. This is a quote about the Khmer Rouge interrogation center, S21. Because if we try to understand mass murderers or serial killers, we also have to look no further than ourselves to realize that their processes are essentially similar to ours. So thank you very much. And those are just a few references.